protocol. If you want to ask a question, ask a question. Just put your hand up. You can interrupt me. I don't care. I see there's a kid here, so I'm not going to swear. Usually I do. I will try not to. Okay? Occasionally, I apologize in advance, by the way, to this wonderful family in the fourth row. So, my name is Shane. I live in London, in the UK, and I am the European manager for the Canadian Independent Music Association, which is CIMA. CIMA is Canada's SaskMusic. We're the national version of SaskMusic. And all the provinces are my job to run. And I run it for UK and European territories. What does that mean in layman's terms? It means we set up showcases called Canadian Blast all over Europe. We did 36 in 18 countries last year. Travel a lot. We also do Canada Day events all over Europe, and the biggest one outside of Canada is in London, in Trafalgar Square. We had 70,000 people there last year, and we're probably going to get about 100,000 there this year. And also, I'm sort of the first port of call for bands and companies and CIMA members and SaskMusic members and others to say, hey Shane, I have a question, will you answer it? And I'm usually incredibly honest. So, I've been in Europe 9 years. I was working in London before I got this, or before I started this job. I kind of created it; it didn't exist, and I think that's, and you know, I'm really looking forward to being here. I just did this in Saskatoon yesterday, so I hope no one who was there is here. You're going to hear exactly the same thing. Okay, so I have this fancy thing. Okay. My PowerPoint presentations are really not very pretty because I'm not a graphic designer, so they just tell you exactly what I'm going to be talking about. I'm not going to read things off a PowerPoint presentation very often. I'm just going to talk. So these are the general themes of the presentation. I'm going to try to break it up from UK and Europe, but the first thing that everyone has to know is that Europe in this conversation doesn't exist, okay? When you talk about Europe and someone says, I want to tour Europe, I automatically think they're naive and they're not going to do it. Because why? Europe has many different countries in it, and every single country is different. Every single country has different rules of engagement, let alone every single city in every single country. You have different teams in each country working for you, in theory, and they don't really communicate with each other that much, depending on what it is. So when you say, I want to tour Europe, think about it a little bit and actually focus on 1 or 2 countries in which you feel your music is best suited for. And I'll try to guide you through that. So we're mainly going to be focusing on UK, Germany, and France, because they're the biggest countries. So, and they're the ones you'll probably go to first. So these are the theories. So we're going to start with labels versus distribution. Okay, first off, everyone understands what a licensing deal is versus a distribution deal, right? Okay, no one's talking to me. All right, that's fine. The difference between it, to me, is a distribution deal you're paying for the marketing, and a licensing deal they're paying for the marketing. That's pretty much what the difference is. And to me, obviously, licensing deals are becoming a little bit more difficult to get in Europe. The first things first is that, and I had to deal with this yesterday as well with artists that were in Saskatoon, do not ignore Canada. Don't think that you can come over to Europe and expect everything to be perfect and people care about you and you play shows to packed houses. No one's going to care about you wherever you are. I'm going to be honest. No one cared about me when I first came there. I don't even think they care about me now. But they, you know, I've been there a long time. I've met a lot of people, and you can't just show up and expect things to happen. Like you can't go to Toronto and show up and expect things to happen. You have to plan it out. You have to understand that you need a team. That team needs time. The team needs assets. There needs to be a marketing plan. There needs to be a strategy and a structure. And it needs to actually be specific to each country, sometimes let alone each city. Okay? So how do you seek out a licensing deal? First off, I always think, look at all these bands that are doing well that you admire. I'm hoping there's a few of them. Well, who are they working for? Who are they working with? Who is their manager? What label are they working with? Who's their production team, their promotional team? I always think when you're a band and you're looking at finding partners in the territory in which you're trying to export into, well, look at bands that you admire, contemporaries, and see who they're working with. Because that's your first port of call. The path of least resistance, as I call it, and I'm all about the path of least resistance in everything I do, And I feel that you should always be looking at people in which you aspire to be, okay? And this is what I said, there's this perfect Robert Plant quote, I'm sure some of you have heard this, is good bands create and great bands steal. And it's true, okay? I fully believe in that. So obviously there's difference between a major and an indie license, right? In Canada, the difference between the major labels and the independent labels is kind of blurry sometimes because it's, other than outside and in Quebec, the major labels own all the distribution channels. So usually when you sign even with an indie, you're usually going through a major system anyways. In the UK, there's much more of a division between major labels and indie labels. But there's also a division between imprints within major labels. And people don't tend to realize this. They say, oh, I want to sign with Universal. Universal doesn't exist. What Universal is a bunch of different labels fighting with each other in the same building. Those labels are called imprints. One of them, for example, is Island. And the perfect example we use, Island is a big Universal imprint. I'm sure everyone has heard of Island. They signed Bob Marley. If you haven't heard of Island, leave, please. Except you can stay, even if you haven't heard of Island. And, but Island co-owns two labels, one called Communion and one called Moshi Moshi, both half independents. All three of those labels have different A&R. They're all fighting against each other to sign the same band. They're in bidding wars against each other. And this happens across all major labels. So what I always say, if you're looking at a major label, if your product you feel is suited, and I'll talk about what kind of generally works in the UK and what doesn't, but you should always try to think about what imprint you're looking at. And also you need to make sure that you get some headway with the major label here. Because the first thing they're going to say is, why haven't Warner Canada cared about you? And then you're like, I didn't talk to them. And then they'll say, okay, we'll go talk to them, right? So you have to understand the specificity of imprints. And imprints you could see as little independent labels with a major label backing, like Arts and Crafts. Arts and Crafts is distributed by EMI. And EMI run a lot of its channels, right, into the shops and so on and so forth. It's kind of the same thing. So when you're looking at that, you have to understand that the imprints are also fighting with the major independents. And the major independents, I'm sure some of you guys have heard of some of them. The Beggars Group is the biggest. The Beggars Group is responsible for Adele and single-handedly saving the music industry in the process. And well, it's amazing. They did this study of UK music exports into America, and then they did a study of UK music exports into America without Adele, and it was like this. You know? But you can use statistics in any way that you want, right? So obviously these independent imprints are going to be looking at potentially signing as many territories as they can. And one of the rules that a lot of these independents have is that they like to have worldwide deals. I always advise against ever signing a worldwide deal, because if you sign with a non-Canadian label in Canada, you're automatically banned from all funding. Okay? That's how it works in Canada. Your funding is directed by your label, especially at a higher level. So bands that have signed with Sub Pop, for example, no funding for them. And it's stupid, because what you should do is you should do I would argue, do a world deal ex-Canada, and then sign with a domestic in Canada, who can then administer some of your funding applications. Okay? I always think it's best, you have to do your research. You have to understand who you're pitching to. Never, ever, ever send an email to someone without addressing it to them. I automatically delete emails that aren't addressed to me, but obviously want something from me. Because I get a lot of emails, and I'm looking for ways not to answer them. I get about 400 a day. And I try to get to most of them. But, being just one person, having an actual job to do, you can't just sit on your email every day. So you have to make sure that your requests are targeted. And there's a specific way to cold call and a specific way not to cold call. And you guys have to you understand what you want to say to someone before you say it. Do not email someone before you're ready to contact them. And what I always ask is, what's in it for them? Why should they care about you? And then you should answer that in that email. And it's true. You, to them, I assume a lot of you are artists, right? Who isn't an artist in here? Everyone's an artist. No. Okay, great. No. Good. Or a manager, or a label?
Writer.
A writer? Okay, artist, fine. And,
oh, okay.
So I always think of it, you are a business proposal to them, right? It's like you're going to them and you're saying, please invest in me. I'm going to make you money. And unfortunately, we live in a business that is kind of focused on money. And you have to think about that. It may, you know, there's obviously, they have to love the music. The music has to be good. I always think that that's sort of a given, right? You should never, ever present music to someone you're not comfortable with. Ever. Always, and I'll say, there'll be another slide later where I'll talk about finished masters. So you have to make sure that you think about what it is that they are looking for. Right? And it's not simple. And when you carpet bomb people with emails, for example, it just simply doesn't work. It's like when you're trying to get gigs. If you target the right venues for your music, you'll probably have a higher rate of return. You may have 10% instead of 5%. But 10 people out of 100 emailing you back is pretty good. Trust me. You only need that one email to make a difference, right? You only need that one response for things to improve, for things to go your way. If you get 99 refusals, that one who says yes negates all 99 who refused. And you have to think about it that way, you know? And what I always do is anytime I email someone that I don't know, I put signifiers in the email that they know. So for example, if I want to know someone who knows someone that I know, like we have a band in the middle that's a mutual friend, I'll mention the band in the email, you know? Or I'll mention a band that he or she works with in the email. Or I'll say something that is familiar to them to prove to them that I've done my research before contacting them. And I will never ever communicate with someone unless I do that first. Because like anything in life, and especially in the UK, you only have one chance to make a first impression. And if you fail, you're gone. See you later. Someone else will take your place. And it's that cutthroat. UK is super cutthroat. And I'm not going to lie to you and say it's easy, because it's not. It's really hard. So, another thing. So distribution, there's a lot of distribution companies, right? One thing about distribution companies is they tend not to take on single artist packages. What I mean by that is they're catalog labels. A thing a distributor wants to know is a release schedule. If you present them with one record, they're usually not going to be that excited about it, because distributors usually make their money over time. They may lose money now in hopes that the catalog will return back to them later. So if you're a label and you continually provide them with catalog, you're of more worth to them. And when I told the guys in Saskatoon, sorry, said the word Sask how many times in the last 2 days, is sometimes it's best for a bunch of like-minded musicians to come together in their hometown as a collective and put records out together as a label. Because what you're doing, it's that basic strength in numbers thing. If you're by yourself as a singer-songwriter, you don't have a team, you don't have a manager, it's really, really hard to get above this glass ceiling. You know, there's some amazing singer-songwriters who I know are never going to be famous or successful because I see the way they're working. And if you sometimes come together locally and you present a label, this is how Constellation was created, this is how Arts and Crafts was created, these really interesting Canadian labels, is essentially by what I just told you. Just a bunch of musicians got together and said, hey, we'll put the records out ourselves. And then you actually become, I would say, a bit more of a business interest to potential distributors. There's two different ways distribution systems work. There's pan-European distribution, which means you start in the UK with a company, and the UK company sub-licenses your album to their partners in each country, which means you're theoretically saying they're going to manage all these partnerships, and you have different people in different companies in each country working on your product. As a band, you may never know who these people are. You'd be surprised, and there's a lot of people, because there has to be different people in each country. You can do that yourself. You can go to each distribution company in each country, and there are, in every country, at least 4 or 5, for the most part, and you can say, you know, here's this business proposal, what do you think? Or you can go to the UK, companies like Essential, right? Has everyone heard of Essential, which is the big independent distributor owned by Cooking Vinyl? ADA, which is owned by Warner. EMI, Music Distribution, pretty simple. Universal also has a music distribution company. There's a few others as well. And then there's others if you're in folk music. Proper is a famous distributor. And I'm going to try to cover as many genres, because genres actually get pretty important in this discussion. Okay? So, also, everyone in Canada tends to be kind of hung up on this whole concept of let's release an album. Right? This is my album. This is my calling card. This is my life. This is everything for me. And I keep telling them, and this is only for the UK, okay? This is different in Germany and France and Netherlands and stuff. Only for the UK. They're not that concerned about albums. You don't have to give them everything right at the beginning. Sometimes your album is everything that you have. And if you spread it out across a series of singles, or you try to think of something creative to do with it, it actually could provide a lot more leverage and a lot more time to market up to an album release. The great...
Sorry, and that's most effective in the UK?
Yes. Well, it depends. If you're a folk artist, like singer-songwriter folk artist, but I haven't gotten to genre yet, you'll get why I'm separating them. Albums are more important. If you're an indie artist, albums are less important. We have a band that we worked with, a British band called Dry the River, who were signed to RCA. And they put out 6 singles over 14 months before they put their record out. And by the time they put their record out, they had sold 1,600 tickets for a show in London. Because they just slowly built it over time. Each single had something clever attached to it. One of them was a flexi disc. One of them had a bunch of recipe cards attached to it. You know, you can think, you know, your music, right, has some level of attachment.
What do you mean attached, like they had vinyl singles that you were attached to, recipe cards? Or just in digital?
Yeah, they sold a vinyl single and they had recipe cards attached to it, and they did different packaging attached to different recipes, which I thought was very clever. There's some people, I know one who embedded a download code in a bar of soap, which I thought was pretty annoying because you have to use it before you get to the... But we saw that before. There's been lots. There's been one that implanted a CD on the back of a Frisbee and sold it as a package for twice as much money. All sorts of great ideas. But I'm not, you know, trying to... I don't think I'm here to just give you creative ideas because I don't think I'm that creative. But it's just... I'm just trying to say, don't be focused too much on the album as the album for album's sake. Because in the UK, they don't tend to care as much. Okay? They just don't. You know, people give away free tracks all the time. And sometimes it's a free download that is what builds a band. Sometimes it's a YouTube video. Look at what happened to Walk Off the Earth. Has everyone heard of Walk Off the Earth? Yep. Band from Burlington that did the 5-person, 1-guitar cover of the Godier song. 70 million YouTube views later. And they got signed by Columbia. Now they're touring Europe. I've never heard one of their original songs. I don't know if they just play the Godier song over and over. But, you know, fine. It works, right? So, that's what I mean by the importance between single title and catalog offerings. Okay? You do have to get that out of your head. And Canadians are really focused on making records and releasing them really quickly. And it bothers me. And I understand why, because our funding system is based on record sales. Right? I'm sure everyone knows this is going to change. It will change in the next couple of years. Factor is an elephant. It changes very slowly. But it is. And the people in power understand the challenge that no one's buying records, but obviously the adjudication guidelines require record sales. Our government needs sound recordings, right? That's the reason why Factor exists, and that's the reason why CanCon exists, to provide more sound recording for Canadian radio. So you need albums. But people tend to release and then 2 months later, record and then 2 months later release a record. And in the UK, people aren't that focused on that. You can release a song, and you can, you know, for free, and you can market a free download as much as you can market a record. So I'll leave it at that. The UK is much more malleable, much more malleable. Germany, Belgium, Netherlands are very release-driven markets, kind of like Canada. They're German, right? They like things to be a certain way, and it's true. And they tend to be focused very much on a release. A release is your entry point to the market. The hardest market in Europe for releases is Belgium. They won't touch you unless you have an album coming out. And it can get really annoying, because you can do this great tour in the Netherlands and you can't play in Belgium because you don't have your album out in Belgium. And it's like a 2-hour drive, right? So, what I mean by rule of thumb in the UK and how Europe, we have this sort of saying, and that everyone in Europe listens to the UK and no one listens to anybody else. So, if you develop a level of success in the UK, it tends to translate in other countries in Europe, because the main sort of methods of dissemination in the UK, and I'm sure you guys have heard of them, NME, Q, Mojo, Uncut, people like that, the magazines, they're still popular, they're still well known, and they still work. And when you get a level of success in the UK, it does tend to translate. There's actually British nights in major cities in Europe that program Canadian bands. I think it's amazing. They're called the London Calling. And they happen in Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, and they just program cool hip indie bands. They can be Canadian. They don't care. They just think the idea of it is London Calling, right? So, but if you're big in Germany, you're big in Germany. If you're big in France, you're big in France. And it doesn't matter, unfortunately. One of the biggest Canadian bands in German history is Billy Talent. Anyone didn't know that? They've sold hundreds of thousands of records in Germany. They can't sell 300 tickets in London. Cour de Pirates, French singing, really good Montreal singer, sold 330,000 records last year in France. She came to London, sold 8 tickets. That's a 2-hour train ride. It's just this weird thing that it doesn't seem to translate. And every country has its own eccentricities as well. There's certain types of music that work in Berlin, there's certain types of music that work in Cologne, there's certain types of music that work in Hamburg and in Munich, and those are the 4 big cities in Germany, by the way. But the UK, if you have enemy writing about you, things are going your way in the UK, it tends to work. And one of the reasons why is because the pan-European industry, that means the people who can actually do things all across Europe, are mostly based in the UK. 9 out of 10 of them. And most of the booking agents that will work across Europe are based in the UK. There's a couple in Germany, there's one in Sweden for some reason, there's one in the Netherlands, but for the most part they're based in the UK. Okay? So, publishing is kind of the same as, I would argue in this context, the same as licensing. And by that I mean you have to understand that if you get something, you're giving something back as well. So anytime you get a publishing advance, if there's a UK publisher that is interested in signing you, they're going to want that money back somehow. And you have to make sure that in the contract you understand how they're going to get it back. There's no such thing anymore as a non-recoupable advance. There's no such thing as giving you money and then not wanting it back. It just doesn't exist. That's why this whole concept of A&R is dying, right? It's, all these television shows that are essentially reverse A&R, where they start you at the top and the audience judge you all the way to the finals, which is the opposite of how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to start and then wait, and then when you're good, the audience judges you, right? So it's the same. And publishing is much like licensing in this context. There's a lot of publishing companies in the UK. There's probably 50 or 60 of them. There's pan-European, there's over 100. There's a lot of domestic German publishers as well, and sub-publishers. But a sub-publisher will take your catalog for their territory and try to exploit it, right? You should look, one thing, at the percentages. The percentages of publishing should never be worse than 75-25. You get 75, they get 25. And you should also be careful on how much money they're advancing you, if they're advancing you. In the 70s, 80s, even 90s, a lot of publishers, and even nowadays it still does happen, but publishers used to give you 3 months of living expenses. But that is always recoupable. It's fine to take a loan, right? As long as you know that you have to pay it back. It's the same in Canada, if you negotiate with a Canadian publisher. And this, coming back to genre, this is one of the most interesting things that I encountered when I moved to Europe and began working in music, is how there are parallel music industries in the UK. And this doesn't exist on the continent, by the way, as much. Just in the UK. There are parallel music industries that do not communicate with each other at all, in any way. And what I mean by that, there are completely separate infrastructures for indie, for folk, for metal, for electronic, for hip-hop, and so on. Literally, there's different distribution companies, there's different booking agents, there's different venues, there's different websites, obviously, different everything, and they don't talk to each other. No one talks to anybody outside of genres. What this means as a Canadian artist is in Canada, we're a lot more forgiving. We have singer-songwriter folk bands playing with indie bands, right? That doesn't happen in the UK. You have to decide where you want to be placed. And this is a very serious decision that is not to be taken lightly as an artist. If you have a folk agent, you'll never be written about by Enemy. If you have an indie agent, you will never play Cambridge Folk Festival, unless you're Seth Lakeman, who found a way, the one person. But, you know, there's different festivals. There's different everything. The biggest, I would say, separation, even though the music is kind of the same as folk and indie, but folk agents tend to be older, just in general. There's different radio shows for folk. There's different venues, folk clubs. And one of those telltale signs is there is not a folk club within the M25 in London. There isn't a folk club in the ring road that surrounds London. So London has a big highway around it called the M25, which is about 50 miles square, or whatever, 75 miles square. There isn't a folk club in London. There's a folk club in Twickenham, which is a suburb of London of a suburb of London. But to show that there's no folk clubs there is showing you that if you're a folk artist, this isn't where you should be going. And there are no folk agents, minus one, that actually are based out of London. They're all based out of farms in the north of England for some reason. And the big-time agents in folk are separate from the agency group and CAA and William Morris. There's actually separate big-time folk agents. The two biggest are Adastra and Asgard. And they book folk bands. By folk, I mean trad. Usually singer-songwriters. Usually you're singing about like something pastoral. You know? It's true. John K. Sampson, he's a folk artist in the UK. He wouldn't play with indie bands. Odd, but it's just kind of the way it is. And you really do have to think about this. If you're an electronic artist, there's multiple electronic genres, and they don't communicate with each other. There's different booking agencies for house, techno, trance, even hard techno, funky house, and electronic confuses the heck out of me because there's a lot of subgenres. Metal is this complete different infrastructure, completely different. And there's 5 major agencies that tend to not communicate with anybody else in the outside world other than them. And there's different venues. So what you have to do is, again, do your research. Try to understand and learn these things. There's a venue in London, if you're an indie band, that if you don't sell out, you can't move forward in London. It's called the Lexington. Okay? It's 200 capacity. If you can't sell that out, you can't move forward. There's a similar venue in folk, there's a similar venue in metal. But they're different venues. It's the underworld for metal. I'm sure some people have heard of the underworld in London. It's horrible. It's a basement. And they don't have very good beer. But you know, that's the way it is. These separations exist in the UK because the UK is a very fickle market. And the UK is really, really hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. It is. It's expensive. I live there. I promise it's expensive. Plus, people are very finicky, they're very sarcastic, they're very demanding. There's enough British music there for all of them to be happy about. They don't actually need any more music than they already have. There's a lot of great British bands that, trust me, a lot of us haven't heard of. Plus, it's a crowded island, you know, it's an overcrowded island, essentially. And what they have is they have this music press that just funnels people in and out of it so quickly. You have your 6 weeks to be famous. If you don't make those 6 weeks count, you're screwed. And you only have one chance to be new. And this, if you're going to take away one thing from this presentation, it's pick your battles with the UK. Do not even communicate until you're ready, until you are comfortable, until you have a story, until you have something to sell to them, something that they feel is worth buying. And because if you go there, and there's a lot of singer-songwriters that go on what I call vacation tours, and I can't stop that. But my job is to say, you know what, every single tour should engender some infrastructural developments. Okay? Oh, more people. That means every time you go on tour, you should come back with something better. You should come back with a better booking agent, or a booking agent. You should come back with a distribution deal. selling CDs, I understand the financial aspect of it, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. You can go on holiday and sell CDs and play in coffee shops for the rest of your life. And if that's what you want, fine. But my job is not to do that. My job is to build the business side of it, right? And help. And you always have to think about that when you're touring the UK. If you screw up your first time, you're in trouble. You know, we have artists that happen all the time. We're having trouble getting licensing deals for incredibly well-known Canadian bands that have put a couple records out. Their record deal is over with their UK partner, and they're trying to find a new partner. But they're on their third or fourth album, and no one wants to touch them. And also, the bands that are super famous here, no one cares about in the UK. Tragically Hip, no one cares about them. Blue Rodeo, they could sell 200 tickets if they're lucky in London, you know? And I promoted that show, lost money. But no, they're nice guys, so I'm okay with it. But it's weird. And the UK, and another thing about the UK is that it tends to prefer things that are a little bit left of center, a little bit eccentric, usually a little dancey or a little weird. If you are a straight-ahead folk singer, or you're just a straight-ahead rock band, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know, you can be really good, don't go to the UK. It's just not for you. They have enough of that. The big bands right now are Caribou, who does very well, Azari in third. Anyone heard of them? I don't want to swear, but there's two bands with swear words in their names that do very well. Effed Up and Holy F. These bands are a little bit different. And I don't know if I can classify what this difference is. But they're just a little bit different to the mainstream. And that tends to be what works in London and the UK. But the thing about the UK is it's a lot like Canada. And I apologize for this in advance, but if you don't break Toronto, the rest of Canada doesn't care, right? Unfortunately. And this is definitely how we see it in the UK. If you don't break London, the rest of the UK doesn't care. It doesn't matter. You can sell 500 tickets in Manchester, come down to London, and sell 10. If you sell 500 tickets in London, you'll sell 1,000 in Manchester. It's just the way it works. So you have to think about routing as well, which I'll go into a little bit. But there's really never much of a point, in a way, I would argue, except in folk music, to think about regional routing if you haven't really tackled London. Because folk is kind of the opposite, because no one cares about London. You actually have to hit the key folk clubs. And those key folk clubs are ones like Rugby Folk Club, which is called Lime Folk Club, or Hebden Bridge Trades Club. These are places in the middle of nowhere, you know, that have taste-making programmers. It's exactly the same thing with an indie, metal, electronic, hip-hop. It's just promoters. Okay? So that's what I mean by the parallel music industries that exist in the UK. Anyone have any questions up until this point? Yeah?
What about jazz?
Oh, jazz is hard. Jazz is for Germany.
And Sweden.
And Sweden and Scandinavia. Jazz is a festival kind of style of music. So there are 4 very important jazz clubs in London. There's half a dozen different booking agencies. And it works pretty much like any other style of music, to be honest. It's just you have to find that infrastructural development. You have to find those people to get you into those venues. But mainly it's based on festivals. Because jazz festivals are so heavily subsidized that they can offer fees for jazz artists more. But those subsidized festivals, from North Sea to that tiny little festival in Poland, usually offer better fees than in the UK. The UK tends to not have, I would say, as established a jazz festival market. But there's a public company called Jazz Services that's owned by the Arts Council that you can Google that is like a Arts Council jazz thing that has loads and loads of information for you. So, woo, all right. Importance of a team. Everyone knows that a successful artist or musician, or whatever we call ourselves, or band, I'm going to sit on this table if you don't mind, I've been standing for 30 minutes, has a group of people that help them out, right? And that group of people, as I said earlier, changes per territory. So you have your manager, and one really important thing, please get this through your head, that the minute you realize that you need help is the minute that you're succeeding. If you feel that you can do it all yourself, you're failing. Think about it. If you can do it all yourself, you're not doing a good enough job. And I always say that bands need managers at a certain level, or artists. I used to work with an artist named Dan Mangan, right? Who's doing well. I'm really proud of him because he's a lovely, lovely guy. And I worked with him for 2 years in Europe, and he didn't have a manager at the time. And he was on tour in Canada, and he got swine flu and was confined to a hotel room in Charlottetown for 6 days. And it was at this pivotal time where we were planning his European tour that he was jumping on right after the Canadian tour, where there were all sorts of questions that needed to be answered, like getting promo to places, just simple logistical things, shipping CDs. And Dan was doing everything himself at the time, about 2-3 years ago. You know, and once he got better, we went for a beer when he was in London. He's like, Shane, I give up. It's time. I'm like, damn right, it's time. And I was yelling at him constantly, saying, dude, please, God, get a manager. And that is a compliment. That is a good thing. And I know that, and I said this in Saskatoon, I think that, especially now in Saskatchewan, there's a wealth of amazing music. And you guys should be incredibly proud of yourselves that you have bands like the Sheepdogs and Library Voices and Rah Rah and Jordan Cook and people like that who are doing really amazing things. All of those bands that I just mentioned have managers, right? Because you get to that point and you just need it. In addition to a manager, everyone has booking agents, publicists, publishers, lawyers, accountants, tour people, so on and so forth, right? So, the first thing is seeking out a booking agent. It's really hard to get a booking agent. I'm sure some of you have tried in Canada too. It's pretty hard. And the reason why is because a booking agent is a percentage-based industry. So if they make 15% of nothing, why were they going to care about you? Right? Because they make 15%. And it is really, really hard because for a booking agent to get involved with an artist, they really do need to see that they're going to make money at some point. Right? It's even harder when you're dealing with an artist who has to fly 5,000 miles to get there. Just sheer logistics. So I always argue that it's never, ever worth talking to an agent until every other piece of your puzzle is taken care of. They are the last piece of your puzzle. One reason is you can book your own shows. I actually have my own booking agency through CIMA that is designed specifically to book those first tours in Europe for bands that we believe are worth it. We booked the first Slow Down Molasses tour. We did the first Library Voices tour. They both have agents now. That's sort of one of these kind of services that we're thinking, oh, maybe it's worthwhile having. But saying that, the reason I decided to start this was because I wanted to bother the agents less. It's so much easier to get an agent to say, hey, come to my show, instead of, will you book me a show? It's way easier to get them to come out to a show. You can also buy them a beer, and that helps, right? You'd be surprised how very simple it is. And there's two different ways that booking agencies work in Europe. There's pan-European agents, and there are some, I'm sure you guys have heard of some of these names, the Agency Group, right? CAA, Creative Artists Agency, William Morris Entertainment. There's 2 UK ones, Free Trade and 13, which are big agencies. There's about 12 in the UK that do bits and pieces of all styles of music, but they have different agents in the office that handle different styles of music, and they don't even communicate with each other. I was in the ITB office a few weeks ago, or a month ago. ITB is International Talent Booking, and it's a big agency. And I was speaking to the hip-hop agents, and I was saying, oh, have you heard about this great tour that this other agent has done with this band? He's like, what? What band? I'm like, you're 4 feet from each other. You're not speaking to each other. It's amazing. So there's 2 ways to go about it. One, you should pinpoint the agent that you want to approach, right? Don't approach them, but do your research. And most agents have their rosters on their websites. And 2, you should decide between pan-European agents and local agents, or as we call them, regional agents. So every European agent, so a UK guy or girl, will then subcontract each territory to a different person, and then they'll manage the team. So you'll have one point person, but that point person will have a person in France, and a person in Germany, and a person so on and so forth. And in terms of booking and releasing, there's two acronyms of countries that come together that you can actually do at once. One is GSA, which is Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, or I like to call it GAS. And one is Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Those are countries which you can hire someone in the largest country, Netherlands, Germany, and they can actually work the other countries. Okay? They have their own partners. Some people have regional offices. And it just works that way in those countries. 9 times out of 10, a pan-European agent will be UK-based, as I said. There are a couple. In jazz, it's different. They're kind of all over the place. Folk, there's no such thing as national, as pan-European agents. In folk music, they only do their respected countries. And it's mostly a language thing, because folk is so sort of tied to language or culture. And you need to know someone who speaks the language or understands the culture to book it for you, right? So, saying that, you can actually go to each country yourself and find someone to help you. Or, if you're lucky, you'll get someone in the UK or in a few other places to do it for you. But you should still know who those people are. And there's a difference between the words booking agent and promoter. Booking agent sells to a promoter, promoter promotes the show, right? That's how it works in the UK. There's booking agencies, and then there's promoters. And there's about 10 big national promoters. Live Nation, AEG, right? Those are 2. And there's some domestic ones. SJM, who are the biggest. Stands for the guy's name who started it, Simon James Moran. There are a lot of acronyms. There's DMP, there's DHP. I think they like to keep themselves anonymous. And that's how it works in the UK, right? Booking agent will sell to the promoter. You could go directly to the promoter and do a show without the agent. You don't need a booking agent. In the rest of Europe, they're the same person. So the booking agent and the promoter are the same. They will book you, and they'll deal directly with the venues, and they'll also promote you. And I don't know why it is that way, it just is. And there are more promoters in Germany than there are in any other country in Europe. Okay? What that means is, it's easier to tour Germany than it is to tour any other country in Europe, because there's more people that you can approach. Germany's also bigger, right? It's the 3rd largest music market in the world. It's larger than the UK. And there's 80 million people versus UK that has 60 million people. So, always comes back to doing your research, knowing who you want to talk to, only communicating with them when you feel it's right to. Publicity. First off, there's no such thing as a European publicist. If someone emails you and says, I'll do publicity in Europe, it's a scam. Just basic. No one can do it. Every publicist that's worth their weight is territorial. You have different publicists in each country. And it works differently in each country. In the UK, you could have 4 different publicists. You can have a national one, a regional one, a student one, and an online one. They could sometimes work for the same company. They could sometimes not work for the same company. But they could sometimes be the same person. My previous job, I worked at a label called One Little Indian Records, which owned another label called Fat Cat, and that was my job. I was the head of press, and I did everything because they didn't have any money. But and that's sort of how I learned this system, because one of our clients was Bjork, who was signed to the label. And you get to know kind of how it works in the UK by understanding the need between national, digital, and so on and so forth, which I'll go into. Every country is different, and I can't really give you guides to every country, but the general rule of thumb is you can usually get one person to do everything in every other country but the UK. So in France, you usually get one person to do all your national, and in some cases, radio and TV. In the UK, it's all separate, and I'll get to radio in a minute. So, publicity is incredibly important still, right? And there is no point, never a point, in the UK, I would argue, for a DIY or an emerging or independent or whatever word you call it, artist or band, to ever hire national print promotion. It's really expensive, and no magazine is ever going to care about you until you've passed a certain level. Because all the magazines in the UK are losing pages, and those pages are expensive to make. And they're usually reserved for dinosaur acts, as I call them. You know? The Pink Floyds and the Stones and all those types of things. Or big UK bands. The best investment that you can make is in digital PR. And there are separate companies that do this. That means seeding your music to online blogs and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter what style of music you do. There's people who do this per style of music. There's different publicity companies. There's folk. Folk is a little different because, again, folk listeners tend not to use the internet as much. So, not joking. So that's a little different. But most, like hip-hop and indie and dance and electro and even jazz, there are people who do this. You should expect to spend between 750 and 1,000 pounds on this, on a base. That means giving someone something to seed, giving them a free track, seeing what the blogs come back with. Because that's always a good way, I think, to enter into a market, is test the waters, right? It's pretty simple. If you have $1,000 Canadian, you can usually convince someone for, what is that, 600-700 pounds to take a chance if they really love your music. And then you see what happens. And then that usually guides you to where you're going to go next. Because you can, through your Google Analytics, I'm sure you guys all know this, you can see who is downloading your music where, right? You can actually pinpoint it per postcode, which we do in London to try to figure out where to do our next shows. We try to understand where people are coming to our website. And if you look at the data and you understand that this is a tool that any artist can use, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, they all have these services, okay? Which I'll get to social networking in a minute, obviously. You can look at who's downloading or listening to your music. That probably tells you, oh, maybe I should be playing here and not there. Because I got lots of people listening to my music here, you know? And it is an easy and, I would argue, relatively inexpensive way to test the waters. Radio in the UK and across Europe is still very, very important. It's very different to Canada. Whatever you think about in Canada, it's completely different. In the UK, it's all publicly owned, right? The BBC runs the gamut. We all pay our £147 a year. We all gripe about it in March of every year to get what's called a TV license. A TV license, which doesn't exist here, right, pays for the BBC. And the BBC is much more powerful than the CBC. The BBC has a version of Radio 3 called SaskMusic, which everyone should listen to if you like that type of stuff, indie, you know, all that. BBC also has the most important folk DJs and stations, and it's mostly on Radio 2. Radio 1 is a commercial top 40 station that's publicly owned, right? It's like a Virgin Radio, but it's publicly owned. And the way you get on the radio in the UK, which still has a huge amount of importance, there's two ways. It's all about the DJs and their producers, the individual people. They actually have a lot of power, and radio DJs in the UK are celebrities. Some of them are big celebrities. Zane Lowe, who's a guy from New Zealand who has the most important show in all of the UK for emerging rock music. He's a bit of a celebrity. There's DJs whose specific job it is to find new music. Jen Long, Hugh Stevens, Tom Ravenscroft, who's the son of a very famous British guy. And so their contact information is actually on the BBC website. It's usually first name dot last name at bbc.co.uk. They all have producers. It's usually the producers who choose, who then filter the music to the DJ, right? That's one way to get on it. And it can happen that way. You'd be surprised. Canadian bands get featured all the time on Jen Long's show because she's my friend. So I just text her saying, listen to this. And suddenly it pops up. Hugh Stevens is also a friend, and he'll play Canadian music from time to time that I'll send him, you know? Or that actually my assistant, who's the A&R guy, will send him, because he knows the music, not me as much. The second way is to hire a radio plugger, and that's the more traditional way.
Radio what?
Plugger? It's just, I think you use the word tracker. It means the same thing. We say the word plugger, or Brits say the word plugger, what am I? And I'm Canadian, so tracker. So it's really expensive, unfortunately. And it's way more expensive in folk than it is in indie. And I don't know why. I've never figured this out. And I've tried to barter down folk pluggers. Never works. The average cost to take one track to radio, which takes 8 weeks from start to finish, would be between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds. Okay? For one track. And that's the best way to get on the radio. You manufacture 100 promos, 150 promos, and this person's job is to literally go to the BBC in Great Portland Street in London, and also the regional stations and There's XFM as well, and there's a few others. And promote your music and get people to care about it. For folk, for some reason, and only in folk, there are people who do both publicity and radio. And they charge between £4,000 and £5,000 for a campaign, and I don't know why. And it baffles my mind. You can get cheaper ones. Mm-hmm.
Are they doing a digital drop? Did you say they're literally taking your CD or whatever? I guess both ways.
Radio is very much physical product based in the UK still. They literally go there and they meet with people. And they have these speed meetings every Thursday. And you have to sign up for them as the plugger with the producer, and you have 8 minutes. You go and you play the track, and you leave. It's actually face to face. That's how it works there. There's very little. There is digital dropping, obviously. But that works more on regional radio, I would say. And the big shows, it's face to face. The most important folk DJ in the UK is Bob Harris. And he loves Canadian music. And he's incredibly nice to us. And he's a wonderful guy. And he's in his 60s. And he plays what he likes. And it's his wife who's the producer. And Sue Harris. And you just kind of have to email them and hope they play your music. And it kind of happens that way sometimes. So you can either go those two routes. But the thing is, you have to remember that radio is really important in the UK. And you can't ignore it. It's not like Canada, where it's, I would argue, slightly less important. Especially commercial radio, because they don't play anything. So, well, they don't. But it is in the UK. So what I always say is on the low level, if you're coming to the UK and you want to promote something, a single, an EP, an album, and you're paying for it in whatever way, expect to spend minimum $4,000 to $5,000 Canadian off the top. Okay? You should know that. You could do it for less, but I don't recommend it because you get what you pay for. And it could be way more than that, trust me. Barbara Sharon is the most famous publicist in the UK. She does Madonna and Kylie and a few others. She's a bit crazy. She charges £50,000 per campaign. I don't know how, but she's really good, you know? So you have to understand that. And I say assembling your assets and manipulating them. What I mean by that is you should make sure that you have all your social networking tools in place. The UK and Germany and the Netherlands and all these countries, they look at the same online tools that we do, okay? YouTube is hugely important. If you're on tour, you should be doing tour blogs. If you're in the studio, you should be doing studio blogs. You guys should have active websites. You should also be active on Twitter and Facebook. But every time you update something, there should be a reason why you're doing it. There should be a strategy of some kind. And I'm no expert at this. I actually have someone who does it for me. But he says he has a strategy, so I trust him. But all I know is that you can't just put something up there and expect something to happen. It doesn't work that way. There's strategies with social networking. What I said with Google Analytics and other analytical tools. You need to know where people are and why people are doing what they're doing with your content. So you can better manipulate them to do more and encourage people to do more with it, right? And social networking is the same. So what I tell people, if you're looking for a publishing deal, you need to not only have your finished masters, but you also need to master your instrumentals. I even tell some bands that they should master stems. A stem is a 40-second selection of a song. It could be instrumental, it could be just the guitar part, it could be the whole song. It's just called a stem. You could have dozens of stems in a song, if you so chose. You should definitely master those. And it works. We had a band from Vancouver called Brastronaut, who I've worked with. They licensed an instrumental version of their track to a T-Mobile advert in Austria. Paid for the tour. Rich Acoin, the Nova Scotian artist, just licensed an instrumental version of his new single to a German supermarket advert featuring the German soccer team, national soccer team. It definitely paid for his tour. And probably a down payment on a house. So you have to look at that. And when you're pitching to labels, for example, you also have to understand that there's also a massive domestic music sync and licensing industry in the UK and Germany and the Netherlands and France and all these countries. There's over 60 sync companies in London. And you should be pitching to them like you pitch to anybody else. And the best way to do it is Google Music Supervision London and see what comes up. And see who they're doing, then follow your path. That's how we did it. And we've developed a contact list of about 60 to 65 companies. And they actively receive pitches for briefs. A brief is a description of a commercial or an ad or a movie or a scene that is pitched for, right? So it's not just labels, and people are so hung up with record deals. Record deals are ridiculous, you know, whatever, who cares? You don't need one. You can get a sync deal and tour off of that. You can just have a publishing deal or even a co-writing deal. You can put records out yourself. There's something called AWOL. Everyone heard of AWOL? But the lesson to all of this is your social networking has to be impressive. A&R people, festival buyers, they look at your YouTube likes, they look at your Facebook likes, they look at your Twitter, all that. And they like to see numbers. If a band, you know, I look at bands that are touring Europe from Canada and they have 900 likes on their Facebook. I have absolutely no idea how they managed to come to Europe, other than just buying plane tickets, right? You do have to think about that stuff, and you do need a strategy, and you can do that here without spending very much money. Regina is as connected as any other city in Canada, and you don't need to travel across the border to get people to care about you across borders. You really don't. We read the same blogs that everyone else reads. We read Pitchfork and Stereogum and Resonant Advisor and, you know, and For Folk's Sake and others like that. Okay? We do. There's no difference. And people do look at that. And then you get a pull quote from something, and then you can build that up into something else, and so on and so forth, right? But I always tell people you don't need very fancy websites. All you need is a holding page with your name.com. That holding page just has Facebook, Bandcamp, SoundCloud, Twitter, contact info. And, oh, if you're selling something, shop. That's it. You don't need any fancy biography. The biography should be on all the other pages, right? And every single page should have the exact same information on it. So there's continuity there. But you don't need anything fancy. And people who have flash designs of web pages and fancy intros, none of us care. We usually never get through it. You just want the path of least resistance. So just a simple, well-designed holding page works. It does. And some of the coolest, I hate using that word, but some of the sort of most emerging artists in the UK, they don't have websites. They just have Tumblrs or Facebook and so on. And on your Facebook page, you can have contact information, right? And make sure that you check the email in which you say your contact information on. We like it when bands communicate with people. And you'd be surprised how many bands don't have their contact information on pages. Okay? Just, again, it's a little common sense. But so that's what I mean by all of this. And I spoke a bit about sync. So how are we doing on time?
We've got about, well, we're about an hour in. So.
An hour in, okay. I got way more to go. Okay. So does anyone have any questions up until this point? Have I offended you?
It's a lot of information quickly for those of us that this is kind of new to.
I know. So
I'm not a manager, I'm an artist, so just curious. The holding page, what's entailed in that again?
A holding page is just yourname.com, right? And all it is links. It's just it could just be a JPEG with some links embedded on it. So you just say name of band or artist, you know, Facebook link, Twitter link, YouTube link, all of that.
So
you don't really
to Facebook, Twitter, and
YouTube, Bandcamp, SoundCloud,
That's
Tumblr.
Oh boy. Can't read that fast.
Is Reverb Nation used at all there?
No, Reverb Nation's an American thing. It's not used at all in the UK. And again, saying this, by the way, disclaimer, right? This is UK perspective. Sonic Bids, I believe, has a completely different reputation in the US and probably has a huge amount of value there. CD Baby probably does too because it's an American company. But in the UK, it's just not what we use. It doesn't mean that you can't use it. Sometimes you have to territorialize your approach. You have to present a different image depending on the market in which you're going after. And one shoe size does not always fit all in this discussion, let alone fit a neighborhood of a city. It's like in London. If you play in West London and you're a certain type of music, you won't get anywhere. If you play in East London and you're a certain type of music, it's that territorialized sometimes. And I don't ever begin to feel that you guys should ever understand that. You should just know people who do and make friends with them. And I will say this at the end, I have plenty of business cards, and any questions that anyone ever has, please don't be shy. I do respond to email, and I will respond to yours. It may take me a couple days, but I will. So, you know, that's just another disclaimer. I want to help. I'm here to help, right? Came all the way to Regina. And got a lot of jokes on the way. I'm not going to say them, though. Okay? But if anyone else has any questions, I know sometimes I speak kind of quickly, and I know that it's a lot of information, but I'm trying to give you as much as I can in 2 hours.
It's kind of a side, because I have to go back to work here, but what's the power situation there in the UK and other parts of Europe? Can I just plug in my gear, like my fax?
No, you need a voltage converter.
Okay.
They're really heavy, and you rent them in the UK.
What about in like other parts of Europe, like Greece or Turkey? Is it the same as the rest of Europe?
It's a different, it's the same situation. You still need a converter.
A voltage converter.
A voltage converter. They're these boxes. They weigh like 10 pounds. They cost about 10 pounds, 5 to 10 pounds a day to rent.
Oh, okay.
So when you're traveling in a band with a band, you always have one with you. If you play at a festival or a conference or a showcase, which we'll talk about, they'll have them there. But never ever put one of those like little, you know, shaving converters on and plug it in. And we've had this situation. We've had a few bands blow very expensive pedal boards because they didn't do that properly. So, but that should be part of your technical rider as well, right? Because then you're not liable for it. So, okay. We're getting into the most fun part of the presentation now. Woo! Immigration! Okay, I'm kind of an expert because I've had to deal with their system for 9 years, and they've drained me of blood and money. But I won, and they're letting me stay, which is nice. The one thing is, it's very simple. Don't be scared of immigration. This is not the United States of America, okay? I know that legally playing in the US can be quite a nightmare and be very expensive. It's incredibly simple and cheap in Europe, okay? The only countries that you need a visa for are the UK and Russia. Every other country in Europe, you can just show up and play. They don't care. The reason they don't care is they're part of an agreement called the Schengen visa-free system. Schengen is the place that the treaty was signed in Norway. And what it means is, you know, has anyone here traveled Europe? You can go from country to country without stopping at borders. It's exactly the same thing for bands. You don't have to get a visa. The only time you need a visa is if you make more than 50,000 euros gross. And if you do, email me and I'll tell you what you need to do. I'm not going to explain it here. The UK is actually quite simple. And one of the nice things about it is you guys have absolutely no power whatsoever with it. The UK system is based on the Australian system of tiered visas. So there's 5 different tiers, or 6. Like tier 1 is highly skilled migrants. Tier 2 is student. Tier 4 is students. Tier 5 is called creative and sporting. In a tier 5 visa, right, that's what you need to come to the UK. It's called a tier 5 COS, or CUS as we call it, which stands for Certificate of Sponsorship. You cannot enter the UK. Cannot enter the UK without one. If you try to come and tour without a visa, you will be turned back, sent home, and blacklisted. And they actually use the term blacklisted, which I find very funny. And a blacklist means you can't enter into the UK for 5 years. The beautiful thing is it's not hard to get a visa, but you have no control over it. Visas are given out by sponsors, okay? If you want to be a sponsor in the UK, which I am, you have to go through this really arduous and annoying process where they come to your house and they audit you and they make you fill out lots of forms and they charge you lots of money, and then they say, okay, fine, you've passed the test and you can sponsor a certain amount of artists per time of year. And they give you a number of CUSs. A CUS is like, it's all online, okay? They don't give you something. What that means is for you as an artist, you need to work with a sponsor. Sponsors, all major booking agencies and promoters, festivals are all sponsors. Okay? People like me, I'm a sponsor. Some venues are sponsors. It only costs about £400 a year to be a sponsor, but they audit you every 8 months. So it's a pain. A visa in the UK, for me to issue a visa for someone costs £10. Okay? One visa per traveling party. It's not per person, it's per traveling party. That includes managers, girlfriends, boyfriends, dogs, sheep. Everybody who comes across with the band needs to be in the application. If someone comes across with the band that isn't, the entire band gets sent home. And they're pretty black and white about this. What you need to get a sponsor, to get a cuz, is pretty simple. You need basic information from everyone in the band. Home address, passport scan, passport number. You need signed contracts from all the shows. And you need a listing of accommodation, of where you're going to stay. You can make that up a little bit. And you can list the venue. They don't tend to care. But the thing is what happens is the sponsor becomes liable for the artist in every way, shape, or form. It is the sponsor whose rear end is on the line if, God forbid, something happens with the artist. What if they get into a car accident and they don't have insurance? What if someone, God forbid, goes missing? What if someone gets sick and doesn't have health insurance? It's the sponsor who's taking the risk. Right? So it's a pretty serious thing. And everyone charges different amounts. It's become a little bit of a cottage industry. And there's people who will just sponsor people en masse, right? And they'll charge ridiculous amounts of money. Even though the cuz costs £10, they'll charge $500, which I find a bit ridiculous. I did the math and I figured out how much time does it take me to hire someone to input the information online and also help me with the audits. And we worked it out that it costs, with tax, £150 per band to do a visa. Okay? That's the cost of me paying someone to do it. Because you have to input every name individually into this online system. And what happens is, once you click send, it comes up with a number. There's a number corresponding to each person's name. It's called a GWB number. You don't really need to know this. And what happens is you copy and paste this number, you send it to the band in an email. The band prints out the email, shows it to the border guard, stamp, you're on your way. That's it. That's how simple it is. So don't be afraid. The key is to work with registered sponsors. So the whole system is intended to deter DIY musicians from coming, right? Because if you don't know someone who can get you a visa, you can't come. We do it for artists, but we only do it in certain circumstances, right? We only do it with artists that we're either working with or that we can trust or that are absolutely desperate or in a holding cell at Heathrow. Which has happened before, twice. So, we don't want anyone in holding cells at Heathrow, trust me. And they send you these newsletters as well, like threatening you all the time, saying, make sure you get your visas sorted because look what happened to this guy. We're like, okay. But it's actually, it's really simple. The onus is on us, the Brits, right, to do it. All you need to know is you have to be working with people who have that authority and power. That's all. And how you do that is you play at registered venues, right? You do proper routing. You work with official people. They shouldn't charge you more than £150. If they do, I think it's a ripoff. Okay? And they're trying to make money off of you. And remember, it's per band. It's not £150 per person. It's just one flat fee of £150. If you work with a massive company like Live Nation, they don't charge you, right? Because it takes them 2 seconds. £10 to them. So it depends who you're working with. But you need a Tier 5. A Tier 5 is valid for 90 days. But the shows in which you play must be on the permit. They could theoretically come and check up on you, if they so chose. Hey, JP. Everyone, JP Elson, Chief Executive SaskMusic.
I want to do that too.
All right. So that's the key, right? You can play any shows that you want within 90 days. Sometimes it actually is down to the border guard themselves. If they really like you or they're in a good mood, they'll extend it to 120 days. We've seen that before, but it's usually on average 90 days. If they really don't like you and you have a 2-week tour, they'll stamp you for the 2 weeks. And then what we are actually audited on retrieving those stamps back from the artist, because the stamp proves that you left, that you came and you left. So what they do is they come to your house every 8 months, your business every 8 months, they say, let's see all the cousins and let's see all the stamps. And if you don't have the two together, you can't give out any more permits until you get the stamps. Imagine chasing bands down for a scan of a stamp in their passport. Ugh. So I'm pretty anal about that. To be honest, I can be, Genghis Khan when it comes to getting stamps from bands. So that's kind of the cost. If you have a cuz, you can bring whatever merch that you want into the country. No one cares. Okay? Sometimes it's cheaper to bring it with you. Sometimes it's cheaper to ship it over. If you ship it over, mark it as promo or you'll get taxed on the duty. Right? And it can be expensive. Always mark it as promo. Literally write promo on the box. Okay? That's very important. Sometimes you'll fool them, maybe sometimes you won't. If you have a local partner in the UK, it's always good to ship a box of vinyl over once and keep it there, because vinyl is really expensive to ship. It's not worth manufacturing anything in any country in Europe unless you're making at least 1,000 of them. Just the costs are too high. And then you have to store them, and then it just becomes a whole big spiel, as we call it. So it's always best, if you're a DIY artist, or you're an independent artist, and you're bringing over 300 records, just bring them over, as long as you have a tier 5. Don't worry about that. Taxation and Social Security are different, and we're going to get into that. But don't be afraid of any of those issues, okay? Because they're very, very simple. And don't be afraid of the visa system. If, by chance, you come, you're doing a European tour, not playing a show, but you're flying through London, you need a visa. If you stay in London. If you don't leave the airport, if you're literally like just doing a connection, you don't need one. If you leave the airport, you decide to spend a day in London, for example, and then fly out to Amsterdam, you need a visa. It's that black and white. So if you're doing a European tour, and I'm hoping all of you will at some point, or some of you may have, and you're not doing the UK, try not to fly to the UK. It's just easier. And UK airports suck. So even though the worst airport in Europe is Frankfurt, it's a nightmare because it's really, really big. And the best airport is Amsterdam. So if you can fly through Amsterdam, it's great. And you can usually fly like direct through Chicago or Toronto, or Montreal. So
You might have answered this question earlier on because I couldn't find my way around Regina very well, so I got here a few minutes late. But do they ever promote single artists or as only bands?
yeah, of course. Of course, single artists are as promotable as bands. It doesn't matter. The music is good, the music is good. So you can pitch a single artist, or a band. I said it's harder to get a distribution company behind a single artist. But labels or sync people or publishers, obviously, it would be the same thing. And it doesn't matter. No one cares whether you are what you are. It's actually a lot easier also to get supports if you're a smaller band or a single artist. We've worked with bands. It's hard to get bands that have 6 members in them to get support tours because no one wants to tour with a 6-person support. Just, simple, right? You always support bands. It's a lot easier to get support slots if you're a smaller band. I see that as common sense. Okay. What I say is the UKBA and HMRC, which I'll get to. UKBA is UK Border Agency. Their website's actually pretty good, to their credit. They drive me crazy and ruin my life for 8 months, but their website is still pretty good. So you can go to it, ukba.gov.uk, I think. It's very simple. Tax is different. In the UK, and taxation is a national issue. So how your taxes work are different in each country. And boy, can they be a pain. The worst country in Europe to deal with your taxes is, guess it, France. The French love their paperwork. And it's kind of a bit of a nightmare. But I can run you through how it's done. In the UK, if you're making over £1,000 gross on your tour, you are subject to something called withholding tax. Withholding tax in the UK is 22%. So that means if you are making more than £1,000, then you go to the border and you declare your income, right? They will take 22% away from you. In addition to that, you'll come back to Regina and then you'll pay full Canadian tax on 78% of your income. So you'll be double taxed, which sucks. So there is a way around that. If you're making under £1,000, you don't have to worry about this, okay? What you have to do is you have to fill out something called FEU 6. FEU stands for Foreign Entertainers Unit. It's actually 5 people, human beings, in Glasgow who work only for bands in Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the tax people. I think that they're lovely, lovely people. I bought one chocolates once for Christmas because she helped me so much. That's all their job is. That's all they do, is help foreign entertainers. So maybe sportsmen and other things like that. What you need to do is you need to do this 6 weeks before. You need to fill out forms. And you need to get all those forms notarized and validated. And it all goes through their office, the FEU. The FEU then contacts the venues and essentially makes sure that everything is legit. And then what happens is your withholding tax is reduced from 22% to between 4 and 6%, which is really nice to get 18% of your money, 19 extra percent. It's actually not that difficult. I can email you the forms if you are in this situation. And if you Google Foreign Entertainers Unit, they have a phone number. They actually have an email address, and they respond. I find it amazing that, the Canada Revenue Agency isn't as good.
Okay, on the $1,000 gross, is that per entertainer or per individual? Can you split it?
That's per band, per group. It's how you're marketing the product. So if you're marketing it as a collective, it's the collective gross. Okay? Because that's how they're going to tax you as a company, as an entity. They won't tax each person individually in the UK, unless you are 4 singer-songwriters. Right?
What if the entity, what if it doesn't exist as an entity, though?
It should exist as an entity first. Every band that comes over, artist that comes over, should have a company registration in Canada. It costs $60 or something, guys. Just do it. It's easier on your tax return too, because you can claim everything as expenses, right? You claim lots of things as expenses. Whereas if you're a sole proprietor, you're just, then it's a little bit more difficult.
Tax workshop next week.
Yeah, I'm no expert. There's a tax workshop next week, especially Canada tax. I haven't paid it in years, so I pay British tax. So all I know about is this system. The HMRC website's pretty good too, and there is a Foreign Entertainers Unit page on it with these people's names. Okay?
What is HMRC?
Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. It's Canada Revenue Agency for the UK. Okay? Sorry, we use a lot of acronyms, so if you ever don't know what they are, just let me know. Okay? That's the UK. France is much, much, much different. Okay? France, you don't need a visa, but what you need to do is you need to deal with Social Security. What I mean by that is France deserves a round of applause, by the way, for 2 things. 1, it is illegal to perform on a stage in France and not receive 72 euros per member playing. Illegal. I find it amazing how they treat, because they see performing as a job. And because France is a really unionized country, right, they go on strike every 30 seconds, or they protest all the time. They see performing as a job. That job needs to be paid the standard minimum wage as anything else. And after you take away your union dues and all this type of stuff, because you don't actually get the 72 euros, but that's the gross. The net is 50, 52, 54, depends on where you are. It's actually against the law in France. And I find that absolutely amazing. That's why in France you get treated really well. In France, it's customary to have accommodation, catering, drinks, for everything. In the UK, if you get 50 pounds and a smack on the behind, that's a good thing. In the UK, it's not customary to get accommodation when you perform. Don't expect it. If you're a folk artist and you're playing house concerts, they'll give you the floor. But you usually have to pay for your own accommodation in the UK when you're touring. Very normal.